The journey to Architect Space took 12 days, and Sienna spent every hour of it beside Jinho's stasis pod, the Valorian. Medical technology could keep him suspended between life and death, but it could not pull him back from the edge where he balanced. And each day the readings grew weaker. She had begun researching humans during the voyage, accessing databases that contained centuries of accumulated knowledge about the species that had emerged from a small blue world called Earth. What she learned both horrified and fascinated her. Humans had evolved on a planet that seemed designed to kill them. Their world was covered in predators and natural disasters and diseases that mutated faster than medicine could adapt. And yet they had not only survived, but thrived in ways that defied explanation. They called themselves persistence predators. Creatures built not for speed or strength, but for endurance. They could run for days without stopping, track prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, and survive injuries that would kill any other species simply by refusing to accept that they were supposed to die. Sienna read about their wars, conflicts that had killed millions of their own kind over resources and ideologies and boundaries drawn on maps. And she felt sick at the scale of violence their history contained. But she also read about something else, something that made her understand why Jinho had stepped in front of that blade without hesitation. Humans had a concept they called love. Though the word seemed inadequate for the weight it carried, it was not simply affection or attachment, but something deeper. A willingness to place another being's survival above their own, even when logic screamed that such sacrifice made no sense. Parents died for children, soldiers died for strangers, and sometimes humans died for people they had never even met, simply because allowing that death would have violated something fundamental in their nature. Sienna began to understand that Jinho had not protected her because she was a princess or because he was being paid. He had protected her because that was simply what humans did when someone needed protecting. The thought made her chest ache in ways she could not explain. On the 8th day, Queen Myre joined her daughter beside the stasis pod, her aged face reflecting the soft blue glow of the life support systems. "You have barely slept," the Queen observed. "I cannot," Sienna admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him falling." Myre was silent for a moment, a luminescence pulsing with something that might have been understanding. "When I was young," she said finally, "our people believed that courage was simply the absence of fear. That brave individuals were those who felt nothing when facing danger." She touched the transparent surface of the pod, her fingers tracing the outline of Jinho's scarred face. "I have lived long enough to know that such courage does not exist," she continued. "True bravery is not fearlessness, but the choice to act despite the fear, to feel terror and pain and still move forward because something matters more than your own survival." "He must have been so afraid," Sienna whispered. "Perhaps," the Queen agreed, "but I suspect that his fear for you was greater than his fear for himself. And that is what allowed him to do what our own gods could not." The ship emerged from hyperspace on the 11th day, and Sienna got her first glimpse of the Architect homeworld. It was not a planet but a structure, a vast artificial sphere that surrounded an entire star and harvested its energy for purposes that no other species could comprehend. The Architects had existed before recorded history began, and they had withdrawn from galactic affairs so long ago that most civilizations considered them myths rather than reality, but they were very real. And they were waiting. The Valorian delegation was escorted to a chamber that seemed to exist outside normal space, its walls shifting with colors that Sienna's eyes could not properly process. The Architects themselves appeared as columns of light that spoke directly into the mind, their words arriving as pure concepts rather than sounds. "You seek healing for the human," they said. And Sienna felt the statement resonate in her bones. "We do," Queen Myre replied. her voice steady despite the overwhelming presence surrounding them. "He sacrificed himself to save my daughter, and we wish to honor that sacrifice by saving his life. Humans are fragile creatures," the architects observed. "Their lives are brief candles that flicker and die in the span of a single Valorian breath. So why would you spend so greatly to extend a flame that must inevitably fade? Because the length of a life does not determine its value," Sienna said, stepping forward before she could stop herself. "He gave everything he had for someone he did not know, and if that sacrifice goes unrewarded, then we are saying that courage means nothing." The architects were silent for a long moment, and Sienna felt their attention shift toward her like the weight of a star. "You have changed," they observed. "When you arrived at the diplomatic summit, you were simply a princess performing expected duties. But now you speak with conviction. So what happened?" "I watched him bleed," Sienna replied simply, "and I learned that some things matter more than protocol." The architects seemed to consider this, and when they spoke again, their tone had shifted in ways that Sienna could not define. "We can heal the human," they said, "but we require payment." "Name your price," Queen Mireille said. "Genetic material from your royal line. Samples that could be used to create hybrids, or to develop technologies that would alter the future of your species." The Valorian advisors recoiled in horror, their luminescence flickering with rejection. Genetic material from the raw line was sacred, protected by laws older than the Empire itself. And the idea of giving it to beings who might create weapons or abominations with it went against everything their civilization believed. But Queen Mireille did not hesitate. "I accept," she said. "Mother." "No," Sienna protested, but the Queen raised a hand for silence. "WHY?" the architects asked, genuine curiosity in their mental voice. "You would trade your biological legacy for a creature who will live perhaps another 50 years at most. Assuming our healing is successful, my people have forgotten something essential," Mireille replied. "We have become so accustomed to peace that we no longer understand what it costs." And this human reminded my daughter that courage is not a relic of barbaric times, but a choice that must be made, fresh each day. She stepped closer to the pillars of light, her aged body seeming small but her presence filling the chamber. "That lesson is worth more than genetic purity," she declared. "If my sacrifice saves him, then perhaps his example will save my people from forgetting what it means to truly live." The architects pulsed with light that felt like approval. "Your payment is accepted," they said. "But we must warn you that the human will not wake as he was, as the healing will bind him to Valorian life force in ways that cannot be predicted. And he may not thank you for what he becomes. Then he can hate me for saving his life," Sienna said quietly. "That is a burden I am willing to carry." The architects began their work, and Sienna watched as impossible technologies surrounded Jinho's body. She did not know what the future would bring, or whether the man who woke would be the same one who had bled for her. But she knew that some debts could only be paid by taking risks. And she was finally beginning to understand why humans had conquered the stars despite coming from a world that should have killed them long before they learned to look upward. They had simply refused to accept that the impossible was truly impossible, and perhaps that lesson was worth more than all the genetic material in the galaxy. The Thornback warships surrounded the architect's station like predators circling wounded prey, their communication channels crackling with demands that echoed through every speaker system. "Surrender the human," the Thornback commander declared, "and we will withdraw without further violence. But if you refuse, we will destroy this station and everyone aboard." Jinho stood in the command center, his new senses mapping the tactical situation with clarity that his purely human mind could never have achieved. 12 warships, each carrying approximately 200 soldiers, against a station designed for research rather than combat. The architects had made clear that they would not intervene in conflicts between lesser species, leaving the Valorians and the small human security detachment as the only defenders available. The math was not promising. I should surrender, Jinho said quietly. One life against thousands is not a difficult calculation. That calculation is exactly why humans die young. Queen Myri replied, her voice carrying across the command center. You measure value in numbers when true worth cannot be measured. She activated the station's communication system, and her face appeared on every screen across the Thornback fleet. This is Queen Myri of the Valorian Empire, she announced. The human you seek is under the protection of my crown, and any harm to him will be considered an act of war against my people. Silence followed her declaration, and Jinho felt the collective shock of the Valorians aboard the station. Their species had not fought a war in over 2,000 years, and the Queen had just threatened to break that peace for a single human soldier. Your people have forgotten how to fight. The Thornback commander replied with obvious amusement. What threat could you possibly pose? We have forgotten many things, Myri agreed. But we are learning to remember. She closed the channel and turned to face her people. And Jinho saw something in her luminescence that he had not expected. She was not afraid. You taught my daughter that courage is a choice, she said to Jinho. Now teach my people how to make that choice. Jinho looked at the Valorians gathered around him. Beings of light who had never known violence, whose guards existed as ceremony rather than defense, whose entire civilization was built on the assumption that peace would always prevail. They were terrified, their luminescence dim and flickering, their emotions pressing against his senses like waves of cold water. But beneath the fear, he felt something else. He felt anger at being threatened and determination to protect what they loved, and a desperate hope that someone would show them how to channel those feelings into action. I need everyone who is willing to fight, Jinho said, his voice carrying the command tone that years of military service had honed to perfection. Not because you know how, but because you are willing to learn. The response surprised him. Valorians stepped forward by the dozens, their luminescence brightening as they made the choice to face their fear rather than surrender to it. Sienna was among the first, her silver eyes meeting his with determination that made his chest ache. What do we do? She asked. Jinho began organizing the defense with efficiency that came from experience rather than hope. The human security detachment would form the primary response force, engaging the Thornbacks directly, while the Valorians provided support in ways that utilized their unique capabilities. Your bioluminescence, Jinho explained. Can you control its intensity? Yes, Sienna replied, though most of us rarely do. If you can make it bright enough to blind attackers for even a few seconds, that gives my people the advantage we need. He watched understanding dawn across the Valorian faces. The realization that their peaceful nature did not mean they were helpless. They simply needed to find new ways to apply their gifts. The Thornbacks breached the station within the hour, their assault teams flooding through multiple entry points with the confidence of predators who had never encountered serious resistance. They were not prepared for what they found. The corridors blazed with light as Valorians unleashed their bioluminescence at maximum intensity, turning the narrow passages into blinding infernos that left the insectoid attackers stumbling and disoriented. Human soldiers emerged from the glare like ghosts, their weapons precise and their movements lethal. And the Thornback advance stalled within the first 10 minutes. Jinho fought at the front of every engagement, his enhanced senses allowing him to predict attacks before they came, and his human combat training allowing him to exploit every advantage. He was wounded multiple times, blades and projectiles finding gaps in his hastily assembled armor. But he did not stop. He had never stopped before, and he would not stop now. Sienna stayed close to him, her light blazing whenever enemies approached. And Jinho realized that she was not simply supporting the defense, she was protecting him. The thought made him fight harder. They pushed the Thornbacks back corridor by corridor. The Valorians growing bolder as they discovered that courage was not a talent but a practice. Some fell, their lights dimming as injuries overwhelmed their peaceful bodies, but others rose to take their places, their determination growing stronger with each sacrifice. The Thornback commander finally broke through to confront Jinho directly, and their battle became the center around which all other fighting revolved. The commander was larger than any Thornback Jinho had faced before, his chitin armor scarred by countless previous victories, and his blade work was the product of a lifetime spent learning violence. Jinho was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his breath coming in ragged gasps that his enhanced body could barely sustain. And his arms felt like they were weighted with lead, but he did not stop. He never stopped. The fight lasted longer than it should have. Blow after blow exchanged while Valorians and humans and Thornbacks watched with held breath. When Jinho finally drove his weapon through the commander's chest, the silence that followed was absolute. "They will send more," the commander rasped, his compound eyes fixing on Jinho with something that might have been respect. "You cannot protect them forever." "I do not need to protect them forever," Jinho replied. "I only need to teach them to protect themselves." The commander's eyes went dark, and the remaining Thornback forces began their retreat. Jinho stood over his fallen enemy, swaying with exhaustion and blood loss, and he felt the collective emotion of the Valorians washing over him like sunrise. They were glowing brighter than he had ever seen them, their luminescence synchronized in patterns that pulsed with pride and gratitude, and something that felt remarkably like love. Queen Myray approached him as he nearly collapsed, her aged hands steady as she helped support his weight. "You have given my people a gift," she said softly. "That cannot be repaid with genetic material or political favor." "I was simply doing what humans do," Jinho managed, his vision beginning to blur. "Yes," Myray agreed. "And now perhaps my people will learn to do the same." The days that followed blurred together as Jinho recovered from his injuries. And when he finally emerged from the medical bay, he found that everything had changed. Queen Myray had formally adopted him into the royal household, naming him Guardian Eternal in a ceremony that the entire empire watched. The title had not been used in millennia, reserved for those who had proven that protection was not servitude but sacred duty. Sienna was waiting for him on a balcony overlooking the crystalline capital, her luminescence soft and warm in the fading light of the twin suns. "Do you regret what happened?" she asked. "The transformation, the binding, the centuries that now stretch before you?" Jinho considered the question as he looked out over a world that had somehow become his home. He thought about the emptiness that had driven him to seek death with purpose, about the years spent believing that his only value lay in his willingness to bleed for strangers. He thought about the light now, pulsing beneath his skin, and the emotions he could feel from millions of beings who had accepted him as one of their own. "I spent years looking for a reason to keep living," he said finally. "And I took the security job because dying for someone else seemed more meaningful than dying for nothing." He turned to face her, and he let her see the truth in his eyes. "I never expected to survive," he admitted. "And I never expected to belong somewhere." Sienna took his hand, her light brightening at the contact, and Jinho felt the warmth of her presence spreading through his transformed body like sunlight breaking through clouds from a distance. Queen Myray watched them with ancient eyes that had finally found hope for the future. The human had changed her people in ways she could not have predicted, and his willingness to die had awakened their willingness to live differently. She had refused to let him die because death would have wasted his gift. And now she understood that his true value had never been as a soldier. It had been as proof that the universe rewards those who choose to protect rather than to prophet, the Valorian Empire had learned what humanity had always known. That strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, and standing on a balcony overlooking a world made of crystal and light. A human warrior who had found his purpose finally allowed himself to believe that he was home. Not the harsh fluorescent glow of military medical bays or the dim emergency lighting of battlefield triage stations, but something softer, something that pulsed with colors he had never seen before, and warmth that seemed to sink into his bones. He tried to move and found that his body obeyed. Though it felt strange in ways he could not immediately identify, his scars were still there when he touched his face. The familiar ridges and valleys of old wounds that mapped the years of violence he had survived. But beneath his skin he could feel something new, a faint pulse of light moved through his veins when he focused. Blue and silver mixing in patterns that matched his heartbeat. "You are awake," a voice said. And Jinho turned to find himself facing beings made of pure light who towered above him like living pillars. "What happened to me?" he asked, and his voice sounded different to his own ears. Deeper somehow and resonant with harmonics that had not existed before. "We healed you," the architects replied, their words arriving directly in his mind. "The poison had damaged your organs beyond conventional repair. So we were required to rebuild you using Valorian genetic material as a template." Jinho processed this information with the calm detachment that years of combat had trained into him. He had been dying, and now he was not, which meant someone had paid a price for his survival. "How long?" he asked. "7 weeks since your arrival, and nearly 10 since the attack that wounded you." 10 weeks was a long time to be unconscious. Long enough for wars to start and end and start again. Long enough for everything he had known to change while he slept. "The princess," he said suddenly. "Is she safe?" "The Valorian royal family awaits you in the adjacent chamber. And Princess Sana has barely left this facility since you were brought here." Jinho felt something shift in his chest at those words. An emotion he could not quite name, that seemed connected to the new light pulsing beneath his skin. He stood carefully, testing his balance and finding it improved rather than diminished. And he realized that his senses had expanded in ways that defied explanation. He could feel the heat signatures of living beings through the walls, could hear heartbeats and breathing patterns that should have been too faint for human ears, could even perceive something that felt like emotions radiating from nearby presences. "What exactly did you do to me?" he asked quietly. "We wove Valorian biology into your human framework," the architects explained. "Your lifespan has been extended by several centuries at minimum, and you now possess sensory capabilities that bridge the gap between your species. But the integration is not without consequences." "What consequences?" "You are bound to the Valorian people now, connected to their collective emotional resonance in ways that cannot be severed. And you will feel their joy and their sorrow as if they were your own, which is a burden that few humans could bear." Jinho closed his eyes and reached out with his new senses. And he felt them immediately, thousands of Valorians on the station and millions more throughout their empire, their emotions washing over him like waves on a shore. And beneath it all, he felt something bright and warm that seemed to reach specifically for him. He knew without being told that the warmth was Sina. The chamber doors opened, and she was there. Her luminescence flared when she saw him standing, and Jinho felt the surge of her relief and joy crash against his new senses like a physical force. She ran to him without ceremony or dignity, throwing her arms around him in an embrace that should have been awkward, but somehow felt exactly right. "You are alive," she whispered against his chest. "I was so afraid." Jinho stood rigid for a moment, uncertain how to respond to such open emotion from someone he had known for less than a day before the attack. But his new senses told him exactly what she was feeling. The relief and gratitude and something deeper that she herself might not have recognized. and he found his arms moving to return the embrace almost without conscious thought. "I am alive," he agreed. "Though I appear to be somewhat different than I was." Sienna pulled back to look at him, her silver eyes searching his face. "Does it bother you?" she asked quietly. "The changes?" Jinho considered the question seriously. He had never asked to be saved, and if he was honest with himself, he had stopped looking for reasons to live years ago. The mercenary work had been a way to die with purpose, rather than simply waiting for the emptiness inside him to become unbearable. But he could not say any of that to the princess who had clearly fought so hard to keep him breathing. "I will need time to understand what I have become," he said finally. "But I do not believe I am upset." Queen Myre entered the chamber then, her ancient body supported by attendants, but her presence still commanding absolute respect. Jinho straightened instinctively, years of military training asserting themselves despite the strangeness of his circumstances. "Your Majesty," he said, "I understand that my survival came at significant cost to you personally." Myre studied him with eyes that seemed to see far more than his physical form. "You understand correctly," she replied. "I gave genetic material from my royal line to beings who may use it in ways we cannot predict." "Why?" Jinho asked, and the question was not a challenge but genuine confusion. "I am a hired guard, and my contract ended when I launched that escape pod." "You are not a contract," Myre said, echoing words that her daughter had spoken weeks earlier. "You are proof that courage still exists in a galaxy that has grown comfortable with cowardice." She approached him slowly, and Jinho felt the weight of her emotions pressing against his new senses. A complicated mixture of hope and fear and determination that he could barely process. "My people have forgotten what it means to sacrifice," she continued. "We have lived in peace so long that we no longer understand the cost of maintaining it. And when the assassins came, our guards froze because they could not comprehend that violence required response." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the same scars that her daughter had memorized during the long weeks of waiting. "You did not freeze," she said. "You acted without hesitation. And my daughter is alive because you remembered what my people have forgotten." "I was simply doing my job," Jinho replied. But even as he said it, he knew it was not entirely true. He had been doing something else in that moment. Something that had nothing to do with contracts or payments. He had been protecting someone who needed protection. And that had always felt more like purpose than employment. Before he could examine that thought further, alarms began screaming throughout the station. Jinho's enhanced senses immediately identified the threat. Dozens of ships dropping out of hyperspace with weapon systems already charging. And he recognized the energy signatures from the diplomatic station attack. The Thornback Collective had found them. "They tracked us here," Sienna said, her luminescence flickering with sudden fear. "They have come for me," Jinho realized, feeling the truth of it in his bones. The attack was never really about you. And killing a Valorian princess would have been useful. But I survived when I should have died. He turned to the queen, and his voice carried the calm certainty of a soldier assessing a battlefield. "I have become a symbol," he said. "A human who is worth saving by people who do not save humans, and if I remain alive, that symbol threatens everything the Thornbacks believe about the weakness of peaceful species." Myre met his eyes without flinching. "Then we will not let them destroy that symbol," she declared. Jinho felt something shift in his chest again. That unfamiliar emotion that he was beginning to recognize as belonging to his new Valorian self. It felt like loyalty, but deeper than any he had experienced before. It felt like home. "Tell me about the station's defenses," he said, "and show me who's willing to fight." The battle for his survival had not ended when the architects healed him. It was only just beginning. The Valorian homeworld rose before the escape pod like a jewel suspended in darkness. its surface covered in crystalline structures that caught the light of twin suns and scattered it into rainbows that stretched across continents. Sienna had never been so grateful to see those familiar colors, and her hand shook as she guided the pod toward the royal landing platform. Jinho had not moved in hours. His chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths that seemed to cost him everything he had. But his skin had turned the color of ash, and his pulse had become something she could barely detect. She had spent the journey talking to him, telling him stories about her home and her sisters and the gardens where she had played as a child. Even though she did not know if he could hear her, the silence had felt too much like death, and she refused to let death take hold before she could find help. The pod landed with a gentle impact, and within moments the doors opened to reveal a crowd of Valorians, whose luminescence flickered with confusion and concern. Sienna emerged carrying Jinho in her arms, his weight surprisingly light for someone who had fought so fiercely, and she felt the collective gasp of her people as they saw the blood that stained her ceremonial robes. "He needs healers," Sienna demanded, her voice carrying a command she had never used before. Now, the royal physicians came quickly, their silver instruments humming as they scanned the unconscious human, and Sienna watched their expressions shift from professional concern to something closer to despair. "Your Highness," the lead physician said carefully, "we do not have experience with human biology, and the toxin in his system has already caused significant damage." "Then learn," Sienna replied, her luminescence flaring bright with emotion. "He is dying because he protected me, and I will not accept that we cannot save him." The physicians exchanged uncertain glances, but before they could respond, the crowd parted to reveal a figure whose presence commanded instant silence. Queen Marae walked slowly, her ancient body supported by attendants on either side, but her eyes remained sharp, and her luminescence still carried the weight of absolute authority. She had ruled the Valorian Empire for 3 centuries, and in that time she had seen more than any of her subjects could imagine. She approached the table where Jinho lay surrounded by helpless physicians, and Sienna felt her heart clench with fear. Her mother had never approved of hiring human guards, calling it an unnecessary indulgence in the aesthetics of violence. "Mother," Sienna began, but the queen raised a hand for silence. Marae studied the human with an expression that Sienna could not read, her aged fingers reaching out to touch the scars that marked his face. "Tell me what happened," the queen commanded softly. Sienna told her everything. She described the attack and how quickly it had come, how the Valorian guards had frozen in confusion while Jinho had moved without hesitation to place himself between death and duty. She spoke of the wounds he had taken and the calm way he had continued, fighting through pain that should have dropped any creature to its knees. She described his final words and the smile that had crossed his face, even as poison spread through his veins. When she finished, the throne room had grown very quiet. "He knew he would die," Sienna said, her voice breaking. "He knew from the moment he stepped in front of that blade, and he did it anyway." Queen Mirae remained silent for a long moment, her hand still resting on Jinho's scarred cheek. Then she turned to address her advisors, and her voice carried the weight of centuries. "What do our physicians say?" The lead physician stepped forward, his luminescence dim with regret. "The toxin has damaged his organs beyond our ability to repair, Your Majesty, and human biology is simply too different from our own for us to attempt experimental procedures. As the risk of accelerating his death is too great, then we will seek help elsewhere," the queen declared. The advisors shifted uncomfortably, and Sienna saw her mother's chief counselor step forward with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "while the human sacrifice was admirable, we must consider practical matters. As his kind are short-lived compared to our people, and even if we could heal him, He would likely survive only a few more decades at most. Your point? The Queen asked, her voice dangerously calm. The resources required to save him would be significant. The counselor continued, and there are those who might question whether such an expenditure is wise for a hired guard, who has already fulfilled his contract. Sana felt rage building in her chest, a sensation she had never experienced before. He is not a contract, she said, stepping forward to face the counselor directly. He is a person who chose to suffer for someone he did not know. And if we let him die because it is convenient, then what does that make us? The counselor opened his mouth to respond, but Queen Mireille spoke first. It makes us exactly what our enemies believe we are, she said. Soft creatures who have forgotten the value of sacrifice, because we have never had to make one ourselves. She turned to face her court, a luminescence blazing with sudden intensity that made even the youngest Valorians step back in awe. I will invoke the ancient right of eternal debt, the Queen announced. This human bled for my daughter and for the honor of our people, and we will not repay that debt with abandonment. The court erupted in whispered shock, and Sienna felt tears forming in her eyes once more. The right of eternal debt had not been invoked in over 1,000 years, and it bound the entire empire to the survival of a single individual, Your Majesty. Another advisor ventured. We do not have the medical knowledge to save him, and no species in our alliance possesses such capabilities either. Then we will go beyond our alliance, Queen Mireille replied. We will seek the architects. The silence that followed was absolute. The architects were ancient beings who had built empires when the Valorians were still learning to walk upright. And they possessed technologies that bordered on magic, but they were also dangerous, demanding prices that few could pay and changing those who sought their help in ways that could not be predicted. Mother, Sienna said quietly, are you certain? Queen Mireille looked at her daughter, and for a moment Sienna saw not a queen, but simply an old woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. I am certain, Mireille replied, that if we let this man die, we will have lost something far more valuable than any price the architects might demand. She gestured to her attendants, who began preparing Jinho for transport. Send envoys ahead to arrange our arrival, the Queen commanded, and tell the architects that the Valorian Empire comes to beg a favor. Sana watched as her mother took charge with an energy she had not shown in decades, and she wondered what it meant that a dying human had awakened something in the ancient queen that peace and prosperity had let sleep for so long, whatever came next. She knew that nothing would ever be the same. The Valorians were about to learn that some debts could not be calculated in currency or treaties. Some debts could only be paid in the willingness to sacrifice everything for someone who had already sacrificed everything for you. The crystalline halls of the diplomatic station glittered with the light of 1,000 species, but none shone brighter than the Valorians who walked through the crowds like living stars. Princess Sienna moved with careful grace, her pale blue skin radiating soft bioluminescence that pulsed gently with each breath she took, and her silver eyes observed the gathered diplomats with polite curiosity rather than genuine interest. She had attended dozens of these summits before, and they always ended the same way, with treaties signed and promises made that everyone knew would bend when convenient. Behind her walked a human soldier, his presence almost amusing to the Valorian delegation. Corporal Jinho Park stood a full head shorter than most Valorians, his brown skin marked with scars that told stories his mouth never would, and his dark eyes constantly moved across the room in patterns that Sienna found strange. The Valorians had hired human mercenaries as ceremonial guards because it seemed fashionable among the diplomatic circles, a way to show that even peaceful species could acquire the services of the galaxy's most infamous. Warrior Sienna had barely spoken 3 words to her assigned protector in the 2 days, Since the summit began, he did not seem to mind the silence, and she did not know what she would say to a creature from a world famous for its violence and death. "Your Highness," Jinho said quietly, his voice rough but not unpleasant. "We should move to the inner chamber now." Sienna tilted her head, her luminescence flickering with mild confusion. "The ceremony does not begin for another hour. The crowd patterns have changed," Jinho replied, his eyes still scanning the room. 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Groups have shifted to block the secondary exits, and there are 4 individuals near the refreshment area who have not eaten or spoken to anyone since we arrived. Sienna wanted to dismiss his concerns as human paranoia, but something in his tone made her pause. Her people had never known war, and their guards existed mostly for tradition rather than function. Perhaps that was why she decided to listen. "Very well," she said, turning toward the inner chamber. "Lead the way." They had taken perhaps 20 steps when the lights died. Sound's bioluminescence flared instinctively, casting blue shadows across the suddenly chaotic hall, and she heard screams in languages she did not recognize as bodies began to fall around her. She saw them then, emerging from the darkness like nightmares given form. The Thornback Collective had sent their assassins, insectoid creatures with chitin armor and blades that grew from their own limbs, and they moved through the panicking crowd with terrible efficiency. Sienna froze, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. She had never witnessed violence before, not real violence, and her body simply refused to respond to commands. She did not know how to give a Thornback assassin broke through the crowd and lunged toward her, its blade aimed at her heart, and Sienna realized with distant clarity that she was about to die. She did not die. Jinho moved faster than she could follow, placing his body between her and the blade, and she heard the wet sound of metal piercing flesh as the weapon meant for her found a home in his shoulder. Instead, he did not scream. He did not even seem surprised. His hand came up holding a weapon she had not seen him draw, and the assassin's head vanished in a flash of light that left purple spots dancing in her vision. "Stay behind me," Jinho commanded, his voice steady despite the blood now soaking his uniform. "Do exactly what I say when I say it." Sienna could only nod, a luminescence pulsing rapidly with fear she had never felt before. More assassins came, and Jinho met each one with violence that terrified her almost as much as the attackers themselves. He fought with brutal efficiency, using every part of his body as a weapon, and the sounds he made when their blades found his flesh were small grunts that he seemed to swallow before they could fully form. She counted 3 more wounds before they reached the service corridor he had been guiding her toward, and she could see his movements growing slower, his breathing becoming labored. The escape pods, he managed between ragged breaths. 30 meters ahead. "You are injured," Sienna said, stating the obvious because her mind could not formulate anything more useful. "Yes," Jinho agreed, and something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. That happens sometimes. They reached the pod bay, and Jinho's hands moved across the controls with practiced familiarity while his body blocked the doorway. Sienna could see more shadows approaching in the corridor behind them. "Get in," Jinho ordered, practically lifting her into the pod. "The navigation is preset for Valorian space. What about you?" Sienna demanded, finally finding her voice. Jinho did not answer with words. He simply stepped into the pod beside her, sealed the door, and initiated the launch sequence as blade strikes began sparking against the exterior hull. The pod shot into space, leaving the chaos of the station behind, and Sienna finally allowed herself to breathe. That breath caught in her throat when she saw Jinho collapse against the wall of the pod. His uniform was more red than its original black now, and his brown skin had taken on a gray pallor that even her limited knowledge of humans recognized as dangerous. The blades, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They were poisoned. Sienna moved to his side, her hands hovering uselessly over his wounds because she did not know what healing looked like. Tell me what to do, she pleaded. I do not know how to help you. Jinho looked at her with eyes that were growing distant, and she saw something in them that she could not name. You already did, he said. You listened. His eyes closed and his body went still, and Sienna felt something wet falling on her hands. She looked down to discover that she was crying, her bioluminescent tears dropping onto his face like fallen stars. She had never seen death before, and she did not understand why the light seemed to be leaving his eyes, even though humans did not glow like her people did. But she understood enough to know that he was dying, and that he was dying because of her. The pod drifted through the darkness of space, carrying a princess who had never known violence and a soldier who had known nothing else. And Sion made a promise to herself as she cradled his head in her lap. She would not let him die alone in the dark. She would get him home, even if she did not know where home was for a human who had given his blood for a stranger. The navigation computer beeped softly, confirming their course toward Valorian space. And Sienna began to pray to gods she had never truly believed. And she asked them to keep the light in his eyes burning just a little longer. She asked them to give her time to save the man who had not hesitated to save her, and somewhere in the vast emptiness between stars, she thought she felt something listening.